She entered that chapel as a bride. She left it as a ghost. Because the woman who stood at the altar in her veil, who spoke her vows in her name, who pressed her lips to the Duke of Colverton's mouth, was not her. It was her twin. And the Duke, the most powerful Duke in England, knew it the instant their lips touched. How long would you wait for someone? A year? 5 years? What if you waited your entire life for a single woman, watched her from across ballrooms and garden parties and crowded London streets, memorized the exact way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her left ear? And then, on the day she was finally yours, someone stole her face. Welcome to Aristocratic Hearts. Tonight's story is about patience, obsession, and the thin line between the two. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you joining me from? City, country, time of day? Whether it's 3 in the morning and you cannot sleep, or you are listening on your lunch break, I want to know this. Community means everything to me. Tonight, I am going to tell you the story of a woman who was erased on the most important day of her life, swapped out like a chess piece by the very people who should have protected her. Her mother, her twin sister, the 2 women who shared her blood and used it against her. And I am going to tell you about the man who was supposed to be fooled, the cold, calculating, devastatingly powerful Duke of Colverton, and the single, irreversible mistake her family made. They assumed he would not notice. They assumed that because these women were identical in face, they were identical in soul. They were wrong. He knew from the first breath, from the first touch, from the first kiss, and what he did next would bring an entire family to its knees. The story begins in the autumn of 1848, in a chapel that smelled of beeswax and late roses, where a bride walked toward the man who had chosen her, and was not the woman he had chosen at all. But let me take you back. 3 months before that chapel. 3 months before the veil and the vows and the kiss that changed everything. It began, as these things so often do, with a ball. The Thurlo twins were famous in London, not for their beauty, though they possessed it in abundance, dark copper hair that caught candlelight like hammered metal, grey-green eyes the colour of the sea before a storm, skin so pale it seemed almost luminous against the deep greens and midnight blues their mother dressed them in. They were famous because there were 2 of them, and because society could never quite tell them apart. But Piers Stratton could. He had known the difference since the first moment he saw them, standing side by side at the Marchioness of Whitfield's spring ball 3 years earlier. They had been 18 then, newly out, presented to society like a matched pair of porcelain figurines. Their mother, Lady Nadine Thurlow, had dressed them identically, ivory silk, pearl, drops at their ears, the same ribbons threaded through the same arrangement of copper curls. Society had cooed and exclaimed and declared them interchangeable. Piers had watched from the edge of the ballroom, a glass of brandy warming in his hand, and thought, they are nothing alike. Now it is important to understand something about the Thurlo family. Sir Reginald Thurlo, the girl's father, had died when they were 11, leaving behind a modest estate in Hampshire, a mountain of debts he had concealed from his wife for years, and 2 daughters who would need advantageous marriages to survive. Lady Nadine had managed the crisis with a ruthlessness that would have impressed a field general. She sold the Hampshire house, moved the family to her sister's London townhouse, and began the long, calculated campaign to marry her daughters well. But Lady Nadine had a preference. She always had. Colette, the elder twin by 7 minutes, was her favourite. Colette was bolder, louder, more vivid. She laughed freely, flirted with precision, and understood instinctively the currency of charm. Lisette, the younger twin, was quieter. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed things others missed, the servant who limped and tried to hide it, the wilting arrangement of flowers that needed water, the way a conversation shifted when someone was lying. Lisette read voraciously, sketched in the margins of her prayer books, and had a habit of saying exactly the right thing at precisely the wrong moment, because she could not help speaking the truth when a lie would have served her better. In Lady Nadine's estimation, Colette was the investment. Lisette was the spare. Now, in the rigid social mathematics of Regency England, a woman's value was calculated with brutal precision. A girl's dowry, her family connections, her beauty, her temperament, all of it was weighed and measured as carefully as a merchant assessed his goods. The Thurlow twins had beauty, but no fortune. They had connections through their mother's sister, Lady Finch, a woman married comfortably but not grandly, but no title, no land, no income to speak of. In this marketplace, where heiresses with £30,000 could afford to be plain and still attract a viscount, the Thurlow twins needed every advantage they could find. Lady Nadine understood this with the clarity of a woman who had watched poverty approach like a tide and refused to drown in it. She would not allow both daughters to marry merely well. One of them, Colette, her chosen one, would marry brilliantly. The problem, of course, was that the most brilliant match in England had chosen the wrong twin. Piers Stratton, the 7th Duke of Colverton, was not a man who inspired comfort. He was 32 years old and had held the title since he was 19, when his father had dropped dead of apoplexy during a parliamentary debate about grain tariffs. In the 13 years since, he had transformed the Colverton estates from a prosperous duchy into an empire. He owned land in 6 counties. He controlled interests in shipping, in mining, in the railways that were reshaping England's landscape. His annual income exceeded £40,000, a figure so vast that most of polite society could not comprehend it, and so they whispered it to one another in tones usually reserved for discussing natural disasters. He was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair that he wore shorter than fashion dictated, and grey eyes that had been described by a society columnist, somewhat breathlessly, as the colour of a winter sky just before it snows. He was also, by all accounts, terrifying, not in the manner of a man who shouted or struck or made public displays of temper. Piers Stratton was terrifying the way a frozen lake is terrifying, perfectly still, perfectly calm, and capable of swallowing you whole if you took one wrong step. He spoke quietly. He smiled rarely. He entered rooms and conversations went silent, not because he demanded attention, but because people instinctively sensed that his attention, once fixed, was a dangerous thing to attract. He had watched Lisette Thurlow for 3 years before he made his move. 3 years of observing her at balls she did not know he attended. 3 years of noting how she stood slightly apart from the crowd, how she tilted her head when she was listening carefully, how she pressed her lips together when she was trying not to laugh at something inappropriate. He knew she took her tea without sugar. He knew she preferred the garden to the ballroom. He knew she had a scar, tiny, nearly invisible, just below her left ear, where she had fallen from an apple tree at 7 years old. Her sister did not have this scar. It was one of many differences he had catalogued with the meticulous attention of a man who had built an empire by noticing what others overlooked. I have to pause here and tell you, when I first came, across the details of how thoroughly Piers had studied this woman, it genuinely unsettled me. We are talking about a man who could have had anyone, any heiress, any beauty, any foreign princess. The marriage proposals came to him, not the other way around. Mothers threw their daughters at his feet like offerings at a pagan altar. and he ignored them all, fixated on a quiet, dowerless girl who did not even know he existed. When Piers Stratton called upon Lady Nadine Thurlow in the drawing room of her sister's London house on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1848, the shock nearly killed her. She had been expecting Lord Ashbrook, a decent but unexceptional baronet who had been showing interest in Colette. Instead, her butler announced the Duke of Colverton, and Lady Nadine spent several seconds with her mouth open before her breeding reasserted itself, and she managed a curtsy. He sat in her drawing room, a room that suddenly seemed shabby and small with him in it, and stated his purpose with the directness of a man who did not waste time. "I wish to marry your daughter," he said, "Lisette." Lady Nadine's first thought was that she had misheard. Her second thought was that this was some elaborate jest. Her third thought, the one that arrived with the cold precision of a woman who had spent 20 years calculating odds, was that a mistake had been made, and that this mistake could be corrected. "Your Grace," she said, "I am honoured beyond measure. But perhaps you mean Colette. She is the elder." "I mean Lisette." 3 words. No room for negotiation, no softening of tone. He said her daughter's name the way other men said the word mine. Lady Nadine's mind raced. The Duke of Colverton, 40,000 a year, 6 counties, a title that dated to the Conquest, and he wanted Lisette, the quiet one, the one who had sat through 3 seasons without attracting a single serious suitor, the one Lady Nadine had already begun to think of as the loss she would have to accept. "I see," Lady Nadine said, and smiled and began to plan. She agreed, of course. She would have agreed if he had asked for one of the house cats. The contracts were drawn with extraordinary speed. Piers's solicitors had clearly been preparing for some time, and the wedding was set for October at the Colverton family chapel in Berkshire. And Lisette, poor, stunned, bewildered Lisette, was told she was to be a duchess. Now let me tell you something about Lisette Thurlow that her mother never understood and her sister never bothered to notice. Lisette was not ungrateful. She was not cold. She was terrified. The idea of marrying the most powerful duke in England, a man she had never spoken to, a man whose name made people go quiet, filled her with a dread so profound it settled in her bones like winter damp. But beneath the terror was something else, something dangerous, something she barely allowed herself to acknowledge, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She had noticed him too. Not with his clinical precision, not with his years of careful observation, but she had felt him. At the Marchioness of Whitfield's ball 3 years ago, she had looked up from the quiet corner where she always stood and felt the unmistakable weight of someone's gaze on her skin. She had scanned the room and found him, a tall, dark figure at the edge of the crowd, a glass in his hand, utterly still while the world moved around him. Their eyes had met for perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds something had shifted inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. She never told anyone. The weeks between the proposal and the wedding were the happiest of Lisette's life. Piers called upon her 3 times. Each visit was brief, chaperoned, formal, constrained by every rule of propriety that governed how an unmarried woman could interact with her betrothed. But within those constraints something extraordinary happened. He spoke to her. Not at her, not about her, but to her, asking what she thought of the new Tennyson volume, whether she preferred the country or the city, if she had opinions on the railway expansion. No one had ever asked Lisette for her opinions before. Her mother spoke over her. Her sister spoke for her. The men who danced with her at balls, on the rare occasions anyone asked, spoke about themselves. Piers listened. He listened with his entire body, leaning slightly forward, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been frightening, but instead felt like sunlight after years of shade. On his third visit, they walked in Lady Finch's small garden, the chaperone trailing at a discreet distance. He told her about his childhood home, the vast library, the lake where he had learned to swim, the ancient oak in the south garden that was older than the house itself. She told him about her sketches, her love of botany, the fact that she could identify 37 species of wildflower by sight. He stopped walking. He turned to face her, and he said, very quietly, "I knew I was right." She did not know what he meant. She was afraid to ask. They had reached the end of the garden path, a small alcove shielded from the house by a yew hedge, where the air smelled of damp earth and the last of the summer jasmine. The chaperone had fallen behind, distracted by a conversation with Lady Finch's gardener about the state of the roses. For perhaps 30 seconds, they were alone. Piers looked down at her. She looked up at him. And something passed between them. Not words, not touch, but a current of awareness so intense it was almost audible. She watched his gaze drop to her mouth. She watched his hand rise slowly as though pulled by a force he could not control, and hover, not touching, not quite, beside her jaw. Her breath stopped. His fingers curled. He lowered his hand. He stepped back. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges. "There is nothing to forgive." There would have been. In another moment, the chaperone's footsteps crunched on the gravel behind them, and the spell shattered. They walked back to the house in silence, 2 feet apart, and the air between them hummed like a struck bell. That night, alone in the narrow bed she shared with the memory of that almost touch, Lisette pressed her fingers to the place on her jaw where his hand had almost landed, and felt the phantom warmth of a contact that had never quite occurred. And all the while, as Lisette's careful, tentative happiness bloomed like a late rose, her mother was watching. Her mother was calculating, and her sister was seething. Colette had always been the chosen one, the beautiful one, the one their mother had groomed and polished and displayed. And now the greatest prize in England, a prize Colette had not even known was in play, had been handed to Lisette, to the spare, to the shadow. Colette looked at the wedding gown being fitted on her sister's body, and felt something crack inside her like ice breaking on a frozen pond. "It should have been me," she whispered to her mother one evening when Lisette was in bed. "It should have been me." And Lady Nadine, who had been thinking the same thing for weeks, took her elder daughter's hand and said, "Perhaps it still can be." But she had no idea what was waiting for her, none at all. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. On the morning of the wedding, Lisette woke in the guest chambers of Colverton House. The estate was vast, and the tradition was for the bride to spend the night before the ceremony in the house she would soon be mistress of. She woke early, her stomach tight with nerves, her heart hammering. She washed, she dressed in her undergarments, she sat at the vanity while a maid arranged her hair, and then her mother arrived. Lady Nadine entered the room with a cup of tea and a warm smile. "For your nerves, darling," she said, pressing the cup into Lisette's hands. "Drink it all." Lisette drank. The laudanum took effect within 20 minutes. In the 1840s, laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was available at any apothecary shop in England for a few pence. It was prescribed for everything from toothaches to melancholy to infant colic. It was given to children to quiet them and to women to calm their nerves. And it was so commonplace that its dangers were only beginning to be whispered about in medical circles. A moderate dose would induce drowsiness and euphoria. A heavy dose would render a person unconscious for hours. Lady Nadine had administered a heavy dose. By the time the wedding was set to begin, Lisette was unconscious on her bed, her copper hair fanned across the pillow, her breathing slow and deep. Her mother drew the curtains, locked the door, and pocketed the key. Then she went to dress Colette. The veil helped. It was a Colverton family heirloom, dense Brussels lace that fell from the crown of the head to the shoulders, obscuring the face in a way that fashion had made acceptable and tradition had made expected. Colette was the same height as Lisette, the same build, the same colouring. She had spent 21 years being mistaken for her sister. She knew how to lower her voice to Lisette's softer register, how to hold herself with Lisette's particular stillness, how to tilt her head the way Lisette did when she was listening. She walked down the aisle of the Colverton chapel at 11:30 on a grey October morning, her mother's triumphant eyes following her every step. And she thought, "This is mine now. This should always have been mine." The ceremony proceeded. The vicar spoke. The vows were exchanged. And then came the kiss. Piers Stratton lifted the veil from his bride's face with hands that were perfectly steady. He looked down at the woman before him. Copper hair, grey-green eyes, pale skin, every feature exactly as it should be. And for one moment, nothing registered. She looked like Lisette. She smelled faintly of rosewater and linen, the way Lisette did. She smiled up at him with lips that were shaped precisely the way Lisette's lips were shaped. He kissed her, and he knew. "I need you to understand this moment because everything that follows depends on it." Piers Stratton had spent 3 years studying Lisette Thurlow with an attention so microscopic it bordered on the inhuman. He knew the exact pressure of her fingers when she was nervous. He knew the rhythm of her breathing when she was trying not to cry. He knew that when Lisette smiled, truly smiled, not the social performance she offered to strangers, one corner of her mouth lifted a fraction of a second before the other. He knew the tiny scar beneath her left ear, and he knew how she responded to closeness, how her breath would catch and her pulse would quicken when he stood near her, that specific tremor of awareness that passed between them like electricity. The woman he kissed did not tremble. She pressed forward. She kissed with confidence, with a sureness that Lisette, who had never been kissed, could not possibly have possessed. And when he pulled back and looked into those grey-green eyes, he saw triumph where there should have been shy wonder. He knew. He did not react. He did not flinch. He did not let a single muscle in his face betray what was happening inside his mind. A cold, vast, terrifying calculation that was already building toward consequences her family could not begin to imagine. He took the hand of the woman who was not Lisette, and he turned to face the gathered congregation, and he smiled. And inside that smile was a promise of ruin. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of Colverton House, a room that could seat 200, with soaring ceilings painted with scenes from classical mythology, and windows that stretched from floor to near the rafters. Colette sat at the head table beside the man she had stolen, and she performed the role of Lisette with a conviction that impressed even her mother, who watched from the third table with the tight-lipped satisfaction of a general observing a successful campaign. Piers said little during the meal. This was not unusual. He was known for his silences, and the guests attributed his reserve to the dignity expected of a duke on his wedding day. He ate nothing. He drank half a glass of wine, and beneath the table, where no one could see, his hand gripped the arm of his chair so tightly that the carved oak groaned. It was his aunt who first sensed something wrong. Lady Gwendolen Stratton was 73 years old, sharp as a blade, and had known her nephew since the day he was born. She sat at the second table and watched him with the particular attention of a woman who had buried 3 husbands, survived smallpox, and developed an unerring instinct for deception. She had met Lisette only once, a brief introduction during Piers's second visit, but she had liked the girl. Quiet, observant, genuine. The woman at the head table was none of those things. Lady Gwendolen noticed the way the bride's laugh carried. A fraction too loud, a fraction too sure. She noticed the way the bride touched Piers's arm, forward, familiar, as though staking a claim. She noticed the absence of the tiny scar she had spotted below the girl's left ear during their introduction. She said nothing. She simply caught her nephew's eye across the room, and in the look that passed between them was a conversation that needed no words. He knows, Lady Gwendolen thought, and God help them all. Now I want to take you back to that locked bedchamber on the other side of the house, because while society drank champagne and toasted the Duke and Duchess of Colverton, Lisette Thurlow was waking up. The laudanum released its grip slowly, like a fist, unclenching. Lisette surfaced through layers of confusion, thick, syrupy, her thoughts moving as though submerged in honey. The room was dim. The curtains were drawn. She was lying on the bed in her undergarments, her wedding dress hanging on the wardrobe door like the ghost of a future that had been stolen from her. She tried to sit up. The room tilted. She tried again. The door was locked. She pulled at the handle, rattled it, pressed her ear to the wood and heard, distant, muffled by stone walls and hallways, the sound of music. A string quartet, laughter, the clink of crystal, the wedding breakfast, her wedding breakfast. The understanding arrived not all at once but in pieces, each one more devastating than the last. The tea, her mother's smile, the heaviness in her limbs, the lost hours, the locked door. The dress, unworn, hanging there like an accusation. They had taken it from her. Lisette did not scream. She did not pound on the door or weep or collapse. She stood very still in that dim, curtained room, her bare feet on the cold floor, her hair tangled and loose around her shoulders, and she felt something inside her chest close like a fist. She dressed herself, not in the wedding gown. She could not bear to touch it, but in a plain day dress she found in the wardrobe, something a maid might have left. She twisted her hair into a simple knot. She tried the window. It overlooked a sheer drop to the garden below, 2 stories down. She tried the door again, locked fast. And then she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her back perfectly straight, and she waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. She only knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that this was not the end of her story. She was right, but not in the way she imagined. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. How could a mother do this to her own child? How could a sister? But this is where the historical reality of women's circumstances in the 1840s becomes crucial. Under the law, Lisette Thurlow was her mother's property. An unmarried woman without means, without a father, without independent income, existed entirely at the mercy of her family. Lady Nadine controlled where Lisette lived, what she ate, who she saw, whether she had a roof over her head. There was no police to call, no social worker to intervene, no legal mechanism that would recognize what had been done to her as a crime. The laudanum was a common household remedy. The locked door was a mother's prerogative over her unmarried daughter's movements. And the swap itself, well, under English law, a marriage was between 2 consenting parties who spoke the words before God and witnesses. If the wrong woman spoke the words, the marriage was void. But who would believe the dowerless, friendless Lisette over the formidable Lady Nadine? Who would even listen? Piers Stratton would. And Piers Stratton was already listening. The wedding night was approaching, and Colette was beginning to realize what she had actually agreed to. She had wanted the title, the wealth, the status. She had wanted to stand in front of society as a duchess and watch every woman who had ever looked down on the Thurlo family choke on her own jealousy. What she had not fully considered was the man who came with those things. Piers had not touched her since the kiss at the altar. Not a hand on her arm, not a brush of fingers, not even the casual proximity of a husband sitting beside his wife. He had, in fact, maintained a distance so precise it was almost mathematical. Never less than 3 feet, never allowing their bodies to occupy the same space. At the wedding breakfast, he had spoken to her exactly 4 times in sentences that averaged 6 words each. By evening, as the guests began to leave and the servants prepared the bridal chambers, Colette was beginning to feel something she had never felt before in the presence of a man: fear. Piers did not go to the bridal chambers. He sent a message through his valet that the Duchess should retire and rest after her long day, and that he had estate business requiring his attention. He went instead to his study, closed the door, and summoned 2 people. The first was Mr. Enoch Hale, his steward, a man of 45 with iron-grey hair, steady hands, and a moral flexibility that made him invaluable. Enoch had served the Stratton family since he was 17 and would have walked into fire for the Duke without being asked. The second was Lady Gwendolen. They stood before him in the firelit study, his aunt in a chair, Hale standing at military attention, and Piers told them, in a voice so calm it was almost conversational, what had been done. "The woman in the bridal chambers is not Lisette Thurlow," he said. "She is her twin sister. The swap was arranged by their mother. Lisette is somewhere in this house, drugged, I believe, and locked in a room." Lady Gwendolen's face went white. Hale's did not change at all. "Find her," Piers said. Hale was gone within 30 seconds. Lady Gwendolen studied her nephew's face for a long, quiet moment. "What will you do?" she asked. Piers stood at the window, his reflection a dark silhouette against the glass. The autumn moon hung low over the Colverton grounds, silvering the lake and the ancient oak and the chapel where, hours earlier, a woman had stolen another woman's life. "Everything," he said. "I have to tell you. This is one of those moments in a story where I feel the weight of what is coming pressing down on my chest like a stone, because Piers Stratton was not a man who used that word lightly. When he said everything, he meant it with the totality of a man who had spent 13 years building an empire and who understood with perfect clarity exactly how much damage he could inflict when he chose to. Hale found Lisette within the hour. She was in a guest chamber on the East Wing's 2nd floor, a room ordinarily used for visiting maids, small and plainly furnished, with a lock that had been turned from the outside. When Hale opened the door, he found her sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, fully dressed, her hands folded, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Miss Thurlow," he said. "Is my sister wearing my wedding dress?" Lisette asked. Her voice was steady, her hands were not. "I am instructed to bring you to the Duke, miss." She looked at him, this grey-haired stranger with his careful, neutral expression, and something flickered in her eyes. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Something closer to steel. "Take me to him." The study was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. Piers stood beside his desk, and when the door opened and Lisette walked in, small and pale in her plain dress, her hair still loose, the laudanum's shadow still faintly visible in the heaviness of her movements, something happened to his face that Hale and Lady Gwendolen would remember for the rest of their lives. It broke. For perhaps 2 seconds, every wall Piers Stratton had ever built, every layer of control, every carefully maintained surface of ducal composure crumbled. His eyes went wide. His breath caught audibly. His hand, resting on the desk, closed into a fist so tight his knuckles went white. Then the walls came back up, rebuilt in an instant, and he was himself again. But those 2 seconds had been enough. Hale looked away. Lady Gwendolen pressed her hand to her mouth. "Miss Thurlow," Piers said. His voice was even, almost gentle. "Please sit down." "I would prefer to stand, Your Grace." A pause. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his mouth. "As you wish." "My sister is in the bridal chambers." "She is. Wearing my dress." "Yes?" "Calling herself the Duchess of Colverton." "For the moment." Lisette looked at him. Really looked at him. The way she had looked at him. Across the Marchioness of Whitfield's ballroom 3 years ago, with that fierce, quiet attention that stripped away pretense and saw what was underneath. "You knew," she said. "The moment you kissed her, you knew." "Before that, I knew before the veil was lifted. She walks differently. She breathes differently. She holds her shoulders as though she is expecting applause. You hold yours as though you are bracing for a blow." Silence. "How long have you been watching me?" Lisette whispered. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, Piers said. "Since the Marchioness of Whitfield's spring ball, you were standing near the terrace doors. You were wearing pale green. You had a book hidden in your reticule." Lisette's eyes filled. She blinked the tears back with a ferocity that made Lady Gwendolen's heart ache. "Why did you not stop the ceremony?" Lisette asked. "Because stopping it would have been a scandal. Your sister and mother would have denied everything. It would have been their word against mine, and however powerful I am, a duke who accuses his bride's family of fraud on his wedding day becomes an object of ridicule, not sympathy. The marriage would have been voided, your family would have slithered away, and I would have lost you." "Lost me? You never had me." "I know," he said, and the way he said it, the quiet devastation in those 2 words, told her more than any declaration could have. "So what happens now?" she asked. Piers Stratton looked at the woman he had waited 3 years to marry, standing in a borrowed dress in his study at midnight, drugged and betrayed by her own blood, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. And he said the thing that would determine the rest of both their lives. "Now," he said, "I destroy them, and then I marry you. Properly, this time." Lisette stared at him, and then she said the thing he did not expect. "No." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Piers blinked. It was the first uncontrolled reaction she had seen from him, a tiny fracture in the marble surface. "No? You cannot destroy them, and then marry me as though one follows naturally from the other. As though I am a problem to be solved in 2 stages. I was drugged. I was locked in a room. I was erased by the 2 people in this world who were supposed to love me. And now you, a man I have spoken to 3 times, are standing in front of me offering revenge and a ring as though they are the same thing." Her voice did not waver. Her hands, clasped behind her back, where he could not see them, were shaking. "I do not want to be another arrangement, Your Grace. I have had enough of people arranging my life without my consent." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like an age. Piers looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. The cold strategist receded. What remained was something rawer and more uncertain than she had imagined this man capable of feeling. "You are right," he said quietly. "Forgive me." "I am not saying no to you," Lisette said. "I am saying not like this. Not tonight. Not while my mother's laudanum is still leaving my body and my sister is sleeping in the bed that was supposed to be mine." "Then what would you have me do?" "Deal with them. That is your right. They deceived you in your own chapel. But do not make me part of the transaction. When you ask me again, if you ask me again, let it be because we have chosen each other freely, not because my mother chose for us and then stole the choice away." Piers was silent for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, a gesture so small and so deliberate that it carried the weight of a vow. "I will wait," he said, "as long as you need. You may find I am a slow woman, Your Grace." "I have waited 3 years, Miss Thurlow. I am intimately acquainted with patience." And that refusal, that quiet insistence on her own terms, was the moment Piers Stratton fell even deeper. Not into infatuation, which had sustained him for 3 years of watching, but into love. The real thing. The kind that does not merely desire but respects, that does not merely claim but yields, that understands the difference between wanting a woman and deserving her. Lisette left Colverton House the following morning. Lady Gwendolen, who had grasped the situation with the shrewdness of a woman who had navigated 7 decades of aristocratic politics, offered her own dower house. A handsome manor 3 miles from the main estate, comfortable and private and entirely separate from the duchy. Lisette accepted. And what happened next would change everything. Everything. What followed was the hardest month of both their lives. Lisette moved through the dower house like a ghost. She ate what was put before her because Lady Gwendolen insisted, but the food tasted of nothing. She slept badly. The laudanum had left, something in her that made sleep feel dangerous, as though consciousness was a rope she was afraid to release. She walked the grounds, she sketched wildflowers she could not quite see properly, and she carried inside her chest a grief so heavy it bent her posture. She grieved for her mother, not the mother who had drugged her. That woman, Lisette was beginning to understand, had existed for a very long time, but the mother she had believed in. The woman who had braided her hair as a child, who had read to her from storybooks, who had once, Lisette remembered this, with an ache that made her teeth hurt, carried her through a rainstorm when she was 4, wrapping her in her own shawl. That mother had been a fiction, and the loss of her was worse than any drug. She grieved for her sister, for the girl who had shared her face and her cradle, and who had once whispered in the dark of their shared childhood bedroom, "I am glad I am not alone." That girl was gone too, replaced by a woman who had looked at Lisette's happiness and decided to take it. And she grieved for herself, for the bride who had woken up in an empty room with her wedding dress hanging unworn on the wardrobe door. Piers suffered differently, but he suffered. He did not eat. His valet reported to Hale, who reported to Lady Gwendolen because the informational architecture of an aristocratic household is a complex and efficient thing, that the Duke sat at his desk for hours without moving, staring at documents he did not read. He rode his horse in the early mornings, punishing circuits of the estate that left the animal lathered, and himself no calmer. He slept on the sofa in his study rather than in the ducal chambers, because the ducal chambers were the rooms where Colette had stayed, and he could not enter them without feeling the contamination of that deception on every surface. On the 5th night, Hale found him in the drawing-room at 3 in the morning. The room was dark, except for the dying fire. Piers sat in the chair where Lisette had sat during the confrontation, her chair, the one she had chosen, and he was holding a sketch. One of the 43, this one showed her in 3/4 profile, looking slightly downward, the suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth. He had drawn it from memory after her second visit, when she had told him she preferred the country to the city, and he had thought, "I will give her 6 counties of country, and she will never want for anything again." "Your Grace," Hale said from the doorway. "It is very late." Piers did not look up. "She told me no, Hale." "She told you, not yet, Your Grace. There is a considerable difference." "Is there?" She is 3 miles away in a house I own, recovering from a betrayal I failed to prevent, and I am sitting here holding a drawing of her face like a man who has lost his reason. With respect, Your Grace, you lost your reason approximately 3 years and 4 months ago. The drawing is merely a symptom. A sound escaped Piers that might have been a laugh in better circumstances. He set the sketch down on the table beside him and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "What if she does not come back?" he said, and his voice was so quiet it was barely a breath. "What if I waited 3 years only to lose her at the last?" Hale was silent for a moment. Then he said, with the careful steadiness of a man who had served the Stratton family for 3 decades, "Then you will wait 3 more, Your Grace, and 3 more after that, because that is what you do." Piers dropped his hands. His eyes were red. He looked, in that moment, nothing like the most feared duke in England. He looked like a man in pain. "Light me a candle," he said, "and leave me." Hale lit the candle. He left, and Piers sat in Lisette's chair until dawn broke grey and cold over the Berkshire hills, and then he went to ride his horse into the ground again, because it was the only thing that kept him from walking 3 miles to her door and begging. He did not write to Lisette. He did not visit. He had said he would wait, and he meant it, but the waiting was eating him alive. Lady Gwendolen, watching from her position at the intersection of both their miseries, decided to intervene. Not directly. She was far too experienced for that, but strategically. She began inviting Lisette to tea at the main house, in the conservatory where the tropical plants pressed against the glass and the air was warm and alive. She chose the conservatory because it was on the ground floor, because its windows overlooked the south garden, and because Piers rode past the south garden every morning at 7. The first time Lisette looked up from her teacup and saw him through the glass, a dark figure on a dark horse, silhouetted against the grey November sky. She dropped the cup. Tea pooled on the stone floor. Her hand hung in the air, empty. "Oh dear," Lady Gwendolen said, with magnificent innocence. "How clumsy of me! I believe I jostled the table." She had not jostled anything. They both knew it. Now I need to tell you about what happened 12 days into the separation, because this is the moment that nearly destroyed everything. Colette and Lady Nadine were still at Colverton. The annulment papers required signatures. The solicitors were still negotiating terms, and Piers, for all his fury, was a man who operated within the law. They were confined to the West Wing, attended by servants who reported their every movement to Hale, but they were not imprisoned. They could walk the grounds. They could access the kitchens, the corridors, the connecting passages between wings. On the 12th day, Colette found Lisette. Lisette had come to the main house for tea with Lady Gwendolen and had wandered afterward into the library. She stood before the tall windows, a book in her hands, the November light falling across her face, and she did not hear the door open behind her. "Still playing the victim, I see." Lisette turned. Colette stood in the doorway, and the sight of her was like looking into a distorted mirror. Same face, same copper hair, but the expression, the hard, bright fury in those grey-green eyes, was something Lisette had never seen on her own face and never would. "You should not be here," Lisette said. "This is not the West Wing. It is not your house either, not yet." "Colette, do you know what is funny?" Colette stepped into the library. She was thin. The past 12 days had not been kind to her. The fine food had been replaced by plain meals, the beautiful rooms by a stripped guest chamber, and the reality of her circumstances was written on her face in lines that had not been there a fortnight ago. "You think you have won. You think he chose you because you are special. But he chose you because you are controllable, because you are quiet and meek and you will never challenge him. You are a pet, Lisette. A pretty, silent, obedient pet. I am the woman he wanted. You are the woman who tried to steal my life and failed. Colette's face contorted. She crossed the room in 3 strides, and before Lisette could step back, Colette's hands were on her arms, fingers digging into the flesh above her elbows, gripping with a strength born of fury. "He was supposed to be mine," Colette hissed. "Everything was supposed to be mine. You were supposed to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay in your corner like you always have." The library door crashed open. Piers stood in the doorway. He was breathing hard. He had been in his study, 2 rooms away, and had heard the raised voices through the connecting corridor. His grey eyes found Colette's hands on Lisette's arms, and something happened to his face that made Colette release her grip and stumble backward as though she had been struck. He did not shout. He did not rush forward. He walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured, until he stood between Lisette and her sister, and the look in his eyes was something that even Lady Nadine, had she been present, would have recognized as genuinely dangerous. "If you touch her again," he said, and his voice was so quiet it was barely audible, "I will not merely ruin you. I will ensure that the rest of your life is a monument to regret." Colette opened her mouth. "Leave," he said. "Now." She left. She was shaking so badly she could barely walk. Piers turned to Lisette. His eyes dropped to her arms where red marks were already blooming beneath her sleeves. He reached out, slowly, carefully, as though approaching something fragile, and touched her wrist. "Are you hurt?" "It is nothing." "It is not nothing." His thumb traced the edge of the mark on her arm, and his jaw tightened. "I should have sent them away the first day. I was too concerned with legal procedure and not enough with your safety. That will not happen again." "Piers!" It was the first time she had used his Christian name. It stopped him mid-thought. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them, the careful, respectful, agonizing distance they had maintained for 12 days, suddenly felt like the most absurd thing in the world. She stepped forward. He did not move. She stepped forward again, close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough to catch the scent of cedar and ink and cold November air that clung to his coat. "I am ready," she said. "Ready for what?" "To hear you ask again." His breath caught. The firelight from the study hearth, visible through the open connecting door, threw flickering shadows across the library walls. The ancient books stood in their ranks, like silent witnesses. "Not here," he said. "Not like this. Not because your sister frightened you into my arms." "She did not frighten me into your arms. She reminded me that I have spent my entire life waiting for someone else to decide my future. And I have decided. I want you. Not because you are powerful, not because you can protect me, because you knew, because you counted the days, because when you look at me, I feel, for the first time in my life, as though I am enough." Piers closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright, and his voice, when he spoke, was not entirely steady. "Will you marry me, Lisette?" "Yes." He leaned down. His forehead touched hers. His hand came up to cradle her face, gently, so gently, as though she were made of something precious and breakable. Their lips almost met. Almost. The breath between them was warm and shared and electric. And then the library door opened and Hale walked in with the evening post, saw them, turned on his heel and walked out again without a word. Lisette laughed. The sound, bright, startled, genuine, broke the tension like sunlight through glass, and Piers, who had not laughed in weeks, found himself smiling in a way that transformed his entire face. "That man," he said, "has the worst timing in England." Can I just say, this next part is why I love writing these stories. Because what Piers did was not the explosive, dramatic revenge of a hot-headed man. It was the precise, methodical, absolutely devastating revenge of a man who understood that true power is not about what you do in anger. It is about what you do in cold, patient, crystalline fury. He let 3 days pass. Now, before I continue, I need to explain something about marriage law in 1848, because it is essential to understanding why Piers moved the way he did. Under English law, a marriage contracted under fraudulent pretenses was voidable, but voiding it was not simple. An annulment required a proceeding in the ecclesiastical courts, which were slow, expensive, and deeply reluctant to dissolve any union. The burden of proof fell entirely on the petitioner, who had to demonstrate that the fraud was material, that is, that it touched the very identity of the person married. Most annulment cases involved disputes over impotence or pre-existing marriages. A case where one identical twin had been substituted for another was, quite literally, unprecedented. There was no case law to guide the courts, no established procedure, no certainty of outcome. If Piers had simply stormed into the chapel and denounced the fraud publicly, he would have created a scandal, but not necessarily a legal remedy. The Thurlows could have denied everything. They could have claimed Lisette was the confused one, the unstable one, the jealous twin inventing stories. In a courtroom, one woman's face against an identical one is a stalemate. Piers needed more than righteous fury. He needed evidence that could not be denied, witnesses whose testimony could not be challenged, and legal preparation so thorough that the ecclesiastical judges would have no choice but to rule in his favour. That is why he waited. That is why 3 days of silence was not inaction. It was strategy. 3 days in which Colette played Duchess with increasing confidence. 3 days in which Lady Nadine accepted compliments and congratulations with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had executed the perfect crime. 3 days in which Lisette remained hidden in the East Wing, attended by Lady Gwendolen and a maid sworn to secrecy, recovering from the laudanum and nursing a wound so deep it had no bottom. On the first day, Lisette did not speak. She sat by the window and stared at the grounds and let Lady Gwendolen bring her tea she did not drink and food she did not eat. Lady Gwendolen, who had survived 3 husbands, smallpox, and a revolution in France, sat in the chair opposite and said nothing, because she understood that some grief is too large for words. On the second day, Lisette wept. Not in the dramatic, presentable way that society women were taught to cry, delicate tears, trembling lips, the performance of sorrow. Lisette wept with the ugly, total abandon of a woman whose mother had poisoned her and whose sister had stolen her life, and it was the sound of something breaking that had been held together for 21 years by nothing but will. Lady Gwendolen held her, said nothing, let her break. On the third day, Lisette asked for paper and a pen. She sat at the writing desk in the East Wing room and wrote, not a letter, not a plan, but a list of every time her mother had chosen Colette over her. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment she had been made to feel that her existence was an inconvenience. It filled 3 pages, front and back, in handwriting that started neat and ended jagged. Then she folded the pages, placed them in the desk drawer, and said to Lady Gwendolen, I am ready. Ready for what, my dear? To watch them fall. And on the opposite side of the house, Piers Stratton was making it happen. He had not been idle during those 3 days. While Colette promenaded through her stolen home and Lady Nadine inspected the silverware with proprietary satisfaction, Piers had set Enoch Hale to work. Now, here is where the sheer scale of ducal power in 1840s England becomes relevant. When we speak of a duke, particularly a Duke of Piers Stratton's wealth and influence, we are speaking of a man who operated on a level of authority that was almost governmental. He employed hundreds of people. He held mortgages, controlled trade routes, sat on the boards of banks. His solicitors were among the best in London. His connections extended to Parliament, to the judiciary, to the court itself. When such a man decided to investigate a family, he did not merely ask questions. He deployed resources. Within 3 days, Hale had assembled a dossier. The Thurlo finances were even worse than Piers had suspected. Lady Nadine was in debt to 3 separate moneylenders. She had been quietly selling her dead husband's possessions, silver, paintings, a set of antique pistols, to fund the illusion of respectability. Lady Finch, the sister who had housed them, had been threatening to put them out for months, her patience exhausted by years of unpaid obligations. The beautiful gowns the twins wore to balls were rented. The jewels were paced. And Colette had, before the wedding, been conducting a discreet correspondence with a married viscount. Letters that, if published, would destroy what was left of the Thurlo reputation. Piers read the dossier in his study on the evening of the 3rd day, the fire casting shadows across his face, and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. On the 4th morning, Piers invited Lady Nadine and Colette to join him in the formal drawing-room. He had arranged the room with care, the best chairs positioned before the fire, tea service laid out on the Pembroke table, everything arranged to suggest a comfortable family conversation. Lisette was not present, not yet. Colette entered, first her stolen confidence now so deeply embedded that she had begun to believe her own performance. She crossed the room and reached for Piers's hand, a wifely gesture, intimate and possessive. He stepped back. It was a small movement, a single step, but it landed like a slap. "Please sit down," he said, "both of you." They sat. Lady Nadine's instincts, honed by decades of social survival, prickled. Something in the Duke's voice had shifted. The temperature of the room had changed. "I have a question," Piers said. "For you, Lady Thurlow." "Of course, Your Grace." "Where is your daughter?" Lady Nadine's smile did not waver. "She is sitting right beside me." "No," Piers said, "she is not." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a detonation. He told them what he knew. Every detail. The laudanum. The locked room. The years of favoritism. The calculated grooming of Colette. The systematic erasure of Lisette. He recited it in the same tone he might have used to discuss crop yields or shipping schedules, calm, factual, devastating. And as he spoke, the colour drained from Lady Nadine's face like water from a cracked vessel. Colette tried to speak. "Your Grace, I—" "Do not." 2 words. They landed like stones. "You stole my bride. You stood in a chapel before God and witnesses and committed fraud. You wore another woman's name like a costume and thought I would not notice. You were wrong. She is my sister. We are identical." "You are nothing alike." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Lisette tilts her head to the right when she is listening. You tilt to the left. Lisette's pulse quickens when I stand near her. Yours does not. Lisette has a scar below her left ear from falling out of an apple tree when she was 7 years old. You do not have that scar. I noticed its absence before the veil was lifted. Colette's hand flew to her ear. "The marriage," Piers continued, "is void. It was contracted under false pretenses. My solicitors have already begun the annulment proceedings, which will be granted with extraordinary speed, given that I have the sworn testimony of 3 witnesses, my steward, my aunt, and the maid who found Lisette drugged and locked in a guest chamber of my own house." Lady Nadine stood. Her composure, maintained through sheer force of will, was beginning to crack. "Your Grace, If we could discuss this privately. We could, but I would prefer witnesses. He pulled the bell cord. The door opened, and Lisette walked in. She was dressed simply, a dove-grey morning dress that Lady Gwendolen had procured, her copper hair pinned neatly, her face pale but composed. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at her sister. She looked at the room, and she looked at the man standing beside the fireplace, and she stood very still. Colette made a sound, something between a gasp and a moan, and for the first time since the plan had been conceived, the reality of what she had done seemed to hit her. Not the crime of it, not the cruelty, but the failure. She had failed, and she was looking at the consequence of that failure in the form of her twin sister's quiet, devastating presence. Lisette. Lady Nadine's voice was a weapon, honed sharp. Darling, there has been a misunderstanding. There has been no misunderstanding, Lisette said. You drugged me, locked me in a room, and sent my sister to marry the man who was promised to me. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a betrayal. You ungrateful! Lady Thurlow. Piers's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. You will not speak to her that way. Not in my house, not ever again. And then he laid out the terms. The annulment would proceed immediately. Colette would sign a confession acknowledging the fraud, which would be held by Piers's solicitors as insurance against any future claims. Lady Nadine and Colette would leave Colverton House by the following morning and return to London, where they would discover that certain debts Piers had quietly purchased from their creditors over the past 3 days, were now due in full. The moneylenders would be called. The rented gowns would be reclaimed. Lady Finch, who had been informed of the situation by a carefully worded letter from Lady Gwendolen, would close her door permanently. You will have nothing, Piers said, no house, no credit, no society willing to receive you, because the story of what you did, the full, unembellished truth, will be known to every hostess, every patroness, every woman who controls the gates of polite society. By the end of the season, there will not be a drawing-room in England that will open its doors to you. Lady Nadine was trembling, not with fear, with fury. The kind of fury that comes from a lifetime of calculating and scheming and surviving, only to have it all dismantled by a man who was simply more powerful, more patient, and more ruthless than she had ever imagined. You cannot do this, she whispered. I am the Duke of Colverton, Piers said. I can do anything I wish. And then he looked at Lisette. The rage was gone. The cold precision was gone. What remained on his face was something naked and vulnerable, and so intensely private that both Lady Nadine and Colette looked away instinctively, as though they had walked in on something they had no right to see. Miss Thurlow, he said, I believe I owe you a proposal. A proper one. The room went still. Piers Stratton, the most powerful duke in England, a man who had never knelt for anyone in his life, lowered himself to one knee on the drawing-room floor. He looked up at Lisette with those grey eyes, and his voice, when he spoke, was rough at the edges, as though the words were costing him something he had not expected to pay. I have loved you, he said, since the first moment I saw you. I have watched you for 3 years and 4 months and 14 days. I have memorized the way you tilt your head when you are thinking, and the way your mouth moves when you are trying not to laugh, and the scar below your left ear that you got when you were 7. I know that you prefer wildflowers to roses. I know that you read Tennyson in the garden when you think no one is looking. I know that your favorite color is the green of new leaves in spring. And I know that I do not deserve you, not after failing to protect you from the people who should have loved you most. But I am asking you, Lisette, not demanding, not arranging, asking. Will you marry me? Lisette looked down at him. this terrifying, powerful, devastating man, on his knees in his own drawing room, in front of the mother and sister who had tried to erase her, and she felt the fist inside her chest unclench. "Yes," she said. And the word came out like a breath she had been holding for 3 years. They were married 2 weeks later, in the same chapel, with the same vicar, before a congregation that now included half the ton, because word of what the Thurlo women had done had spread through London like fire through dry timber, and everyone wanted to witness the real wedding, the real bride, the real Duchess. In those 2 weeks, something shifted between them. Not the grand, dramatic shift of revelation or crisis, but the quieter shift of two people learning to exist in the same space without pretense. Lisette moved back into Colverton House, not the ducal chambers, not yet, but a suite of rooms in the south wing that Lady Gwendolen had prepared with an attention to comfort that suggested she had been anticipating this outcome for some time. The rooms overlooked the south garden and the ancient oak, and Lisette woke each morning to the sound of birdsong and the sight of the Berkshire Hills stretching to the horizon. They took walks together. Unchaperoned now, Lady Gwendolen had declared that a woman who had been drugged, swapped, locked in a room, and proposed to twice had earned the right to walk with her betrothed without a 63-year-old trailing behind her at a discreet distance. They walked the grounds and talked about everything and nothing. His plans for the estate's tenant cottages, her ideas for the library's organisation, the species of hawk she had spotted over the lake, his opinion of Dickens, hers of Bronte, the question of whether dogs were superior to horses or merely different expressions of the same devotion. It was during one of these walks, the 6th day after the proposal, that Lisette discovered the room. They were passing through the east wing, a part of the house she had not yet explored, when she noticed a door slightly ajar. She pushed it open, expecting a storeroom or a disused parlour, and instead found herself standing in a small, warm chamber, with windows facing south and every wall covered in sketches. Sketches of her. Dozens of them. Some quick, a few lines, capturing the turn of her head, the angle of her shoulder, some elaborate, detailed studies of her face in different lights, her profile against a window, her hands clasped in her lap. Some were clearly done from memory, slightly imprecise, the proportions not quite right, as though the artist had been working from the ache of wanting rather than the accuracy of observation. Others were precise to the point of reverence. Every eyelash, every shadow, every strand of copper hair rendered with obsessive care. They spanned years. The earliest, judging by the slight yellowing of the paper, dated from 3 years ago. The most recent was from last month. Lisette stood in the centre of that room and turned in a slow circle, her hand pressed to her mouth, and felt the full weight of what this man had felt for her before she had known he existed. Piers found her there. He stood in the doorway and watched her looking at his most carefully guarded secret. And his face was the face of a man who has been caught in the most private act of his life. "I did not intend for you to see these," he said. "You drew them. I am not an artist. They are poor likenesses. They are me." Her voice cracked on the word. "Every one of them is me. And they are. Piers, how many are there?" 43. "One for every wildflower on the estate." He said nothing. But the answer was written on his face. Yes, one for every wildflower. One for every species his mother had catalogued. One for every element of the natural world that he associated with the woman who loved them. Lisette crossed the room. She stood before him in the doorway, this quiet, devastating man who had filled a secret room with imperfect sketches of her face, and she took both his hands in hers and held them tightly. "You kept this room locked," she said. "I did. For 3 years. Yes. And you never told anyone. Hale knows. He procured the drawing paper. A guilty pause. He does not approve of my artistic abilities. A laugh escaped her, startled, wet, half-tangled with a sob. I love you, she said, and meant it with every atom of her being. I know, he said. I have 43 drawings that prove I hoped you would. Lisette walked down the aisle of the Colverton chapel at 11:30 on a crisp December morning, before a congregation that included half the ton. She wore a gown, commissioned from the finest modiste in London, not the one Colette had worn, which Piers had ordered burned. Ivory silk, overlaid with the most delicate Chantilly lace, the bodice embroidered with tiny wildflowers in thread so fine it looked like frost on glass. She wore the Colverton diamonds at her throat, and they caught the candlelight and scattered it across the chapel walls like fallen stars. Piers watched her walk toward him, and this time, when he lifted the veil, he saw the scar below her left ear and the shy tilt of her head, and the way her breath caught when his fingers brushed her jaw. "Hello," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "Hello," she whispered back. And when he kissed her, the real kiss, the right kiss, something settled into place between them like a key turning in a lock, and every person in that chapel felt it. The weeks that followed the wedding were a revelation. Lisette discovered that Colverton House was not merely large, it was a world unto itself. The estate encompassed 12,000 acres of Berkshire countryside, including farmland, woodland, a village of 200 souls, and a lake so vast it took an hour to walk around its shore. The house itself had 63 rooms, and Piers walked her through everyone, watching her face as she discovered the library. A cathedral of books stretching 2 stories high, with a gallery and rolling ladders and a window seat overlooking the south garden, and the conservatory where tropical plants pressed against it. Glass walls, and the air was warm and humid and smelled of earth and green things growing, and the music room, where a grand piano sat in a pool of afternoon light. "This is yours," he said again and again. "All of this is yours." But Lisette was watching him, not the rooms. She was watching the way he opened doors for her with his own hands, dismissing the footman. She was watching the way he adjusted the fire in whatever room she occupied, adding logs before she could feel the chill. She was watching the way his eyes followed her, not with the cold observation she had feared, but with something warmer and more desperate, as though he could not quite believe she was real, as though he was afraid that if he looked away, she would vanish. And slowly, carefully, the way a wild creature learns to eat from an open hand, Lisette began to trust him. It happened in small moments, a conversation by the fire, where she admitted she had never felt safe in her mother's house, and he said nothing but moved his chair closer to hers. A walk in the south garden, where she pointed out the wildflowers growing between the flagstones, and he listened with the same intensity he brought to parliamentary debates. A morning in the library, where she fell asleep in the window seat with a book on her chest, and woke to find a blanket draped over her shoulders and a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. She did not see him place the blanket. She did not need to. The jealousy came unexpectedly, and it came through a man named Captain Ives. Captain Reginald Ives was a distant cousin of the Stratton family, a cavalry officer, handsome in the obvious way that Piers was not, with an easy charm and a laugh that filled rooms. He arrived at Colverton for a weekend visit in late November, and within hours of his arrival, he had fixed his attention on Lisette with the cheerful confidence of a man who had never been refused anything. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over her hand with exaggerated gallantry at dinner, "Colverton has clearly been concealing its greatest treasure." Lisette smiled politely and withdrew her hand. Piers, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. But the temperature of the room dropped by several degrees, and Hale, who was serving the wine, quietly moved a crystal decanter out of the Duke's reach. It worsened over the weekend. Ives sought Lisette out at every opportunity, in the garden, in the music room, during walks on the grounds. He was never improper, never overstepped the boundaries of propriety, but his attention was constant and his admiration transparent. And Lisette, who had spent her entire life being overlooked, did not know how to read it as a threat. Piers did. On the second evening after dinner, Lisette excused herself to the library, and Piers found Ives in the billiards room. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. No one else was present. When Ives emerged, he was the colour of old ash, and he left Colverton before dawn the following morning without saying goodbye. Lisette found Piers in his study afterward. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "Nothing of consequence." He looked as though he had seen his own grave. Piers set down his pen and looked at her. The firelight caught the planes of his face, turning his grey eyes to amber. "He was speaking to you as though you were available. You are not. I was only being polite." "I know." His voice softened. "I know you were. And I know that my reaction is disproportionate. But I have spent 3 years watching you from a distance, Lisette. 3 years of other men having the privilege of your conversation, your smile, your company, while I stood in corners and memorized the way candlelight looks in your hair. I will not pretend I am capable of sharing your attention gracefully. I am not. I am aware this is a flaw." Lisette stared at him. "You are the most powerful duke in England, and you are confessing a flaw to me as though I am your priest." Something shifted in his expression. "You are considerably more important to me than any priest." And there it was again. That key turning in the lock. That feeling of something settling into place. She crossed the room. She stood before his desk. And she did something she had never done before. She reached out and touched his face, her fingertips against his jaw, light as moth wings, trembling slightly. His eyes closed. 3 years, she whispered. 3 years, 4 months, and 26 days. You are still counting. I will always be counting. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead, a gesture so tender, so unexpected, that his breath shattered. And then, because Lisette Thurlow had spent her entire life being underestimated and overlooked and invisible, and because she had finally found a man who saw her with such devastating clarity that it felt like being born again, she whispered, "I am glad you knew. At the altar, I am glad you knew it was not me." "I would have known," he said, "in the dark, in silence, in a crowd of 1,000 women who wore your face. I would have known." Stories like this remind me why I love doing this. There is something raw and true about the idea that someone can know you so completely, not just your face, not just your name, but the specific way you breathe, the way you hold yourself, the invisible architecture of who you are. That no deception, no matter how perfectly crafted, can survive their attention. Now, the destruction of Lady Nadine and Colette Thurlow was not a single dramatic event. It was a siege. Piers had promised ruin, and he delivered it with the patience and precision of a man who understood that the most effective revenge is not the kind that burns fast and bright, but the kind that closes in slowly, like winter, until there is no escape and no warmth left. The debts came first. The moneylenders, suddenly, in possession of their promissory notes, purchased by a shell entity controlled by Hale, demanded immediate repayment. Lady Nadine, who had been relying on the expectation that her daughter's marriage to a duke would generate the credit and connections needed to survive, found instead that every financial door in London had slammed shut simultaneously. Her credit was revoked at the drapers, the milliners, the modistes who had supplied their rented gowns. The jeweller who had loaned the paste diamonds sent a boy to collect them. Then came the social death. Lady Gwendolen, who had connections that predated the century, ensured that the true story of the wedding swap reached the ears of every patroness and hostess who mattered. She did not spread gossip. That would have been beneath her. She simply told the truth quietly and precisely to 3 women she trusted, and let the natural machinery of London society do the rest. Within a week, the story was in every drawing room, every morning call, every whispered exchange behind every fan at every assembly. The Thurlo women had drugged a bride and swapped her with her twin to steal a duke. It was the kind of scandal that society feeds on for years, lurid enough to be irresistible, cruel enough to inspire genuine outrage. Invitations ceased. Doors closed. Lady Finch, mortified by association, sent her sister a final letter informing her that the London house was no longer available and that she wished no further contact. By Christmas, Lady Nadine and Colette were living in 2 rented rooms above a chandler's shop in Cheapside, their finery gone, their connections severed, their futures reduced to the dimensions of a life without money, without status, and without a single ally willing to acknowledge their existence. The rooms smelled of tallow and damp plaster. The window overlooked an alley where costermongers shouted their wares at dawn and stray dogs fought over scraps at dusk. Lady Nadine, who had once inspected the Colverton silverware with proprietary satisfaction, now counted pennies on a scarred wooden table and calculated how long they could afford candles. But it was Colette whose destruction was the most complete, because Colette had never learned to survive without an audience. On Christmas Eve, while Lisette sat in the Colverton library with Lady Gwendolen and a cup of mulled wine and the steady warmth of knowing she was wanted, Colette stood before the small spotted mirror in their Cheapside room and looked at her own face, the face she shared with her twin, the face that had always been her greatest weapon, her currency, her certainty that the world would give her what she wanted because she was beautiful and bold and willing to take it. The mirror showed her the truth. She was thin, thinner than she had ever been, the bones of her clavicle visible above her plain woolen dress. Her copper hair, unwashed for 3 days because hot water cost money, hung dull and lank around her shoulders. Her skin, once luminous, had taken on the grey pallor of a woman who had not slept properly in weeks. She looked exactly like Lisette. Not the Lisette who was now the Duchess of Colverton, not the woman who wore diamonds and walked through ballrooms on the arm of the most powerful man in England. The old Lisette, the shadow, the spare, the girl who sat in corners and was overlooked. Colette stared at her reflection and understood, with a clarity that felt like a blade between her ribs, that she had become the very thing she had spent her whole life pitying. She had become invisible. She pressed her hand flat against the mirror. Her palm covered her own face, and the cold glass fogged with her breath, and she whispered a name that no one heard. Lisette. And Colette, who had stood at that altar in her sister's dress and thought, "This is mine now," felt the full weight of what she had truly lost. Not the Duke, not the title, not the diamonds or the estate or the 63 rooms. She had lost her sister. She had lost the only person in the world who had ever loved her without condition, and she had thrown that love away for a crown that was never hers to wear. She wrote to Lisette 3 letters over the course of that winter. The first was angry, accusations and justifications, the desperate flailing of a woman who could not accept responsibility. The second was self-pitying, a catalogue of suffering designed to provoke guilt. The third was genuine. It said only, "I am sorry. I was wrong." I miss you. Lisette read the third letter in the library at Colverton, the winter light falling grey and cold through the tall windows. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer with the list she had written on her third day of captivity. The list of every time her mother had chosen Colette over her. She did not reply. If you think you know where this story is going, if you think you have predicted the ending, I promise you, you have not. Keep listening. Some wounds do not heal with apologies. Some betrayals are too total for forgiveness to bridge the distance between what was and what might have been. And Lisette, who had spent her entire life being kind, being patient, being the sister who understood and accommodated and forgave, had finally learned that some things are beyond understanding, and some people do not deserve the gift of her grace. It was the hardest lesson she ever learned, and it was the one that finally set her free. Spring came to Colverton like a benediction. The gardens erupted in colour, crocuses and daffodils, and the first brave shoots of the roses that would blaze through summer. The lake thawed and glittered in the April sun. And in the south garden, beneath the ancient oak that was older than the house, Lisette sat on a stone bench with a sketchbook on her knee and drew the wildflowers growing between the flagstones. Piers found her there. He often found her there. It had become her favourite place, and he had learned, with the patience of a man who had waited 3 years for a single conversation, to let her claim her spaces without crowding them. He sat beside her on the bench, not touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I have something for you," he said. He handed her a leather portfolio, old and soft with age. Inside were sketches, dozens of them, some in pencil, some in ink, some in delicate watercolour. All of them were wildflowers, English wildflowers, pressed flat by time and rendered with a skill that took Lisette's breath away. "These were my mother's," Piers said. "She was a botanist, an amateur, officially. Women were not permitted to be otherwise, but she corresponded with the Royal Botanical Society under a male pseudonym for years. She catalogued every wildflower species on the Colverton estate. There are 43. You identified 37 by sight." Lisette turned the pages with trembling fingers. Each flower was labelled in a neat, feminine hand. Latin names alongside common ones. Locations noted, dates of first bloom recorded. "She would have loved you," Piers said quietly. "She would have recognised in you exactly what I did." Lisette looked up at him. The spring light fell across his face, and for the first time she saw him not as the terrifying Duke, not as the cold strategist who had dismantled her family with surgical precision, but as a man who had been alone for a very long time and who had found, in a quiet woman who loved wildflowers, the answer to a loneliness he had never known how to name. She kissed him, not on the forehead as before, not carefully, not tentatively, not with the shy restraint of a woman learning to trust. She kissed him on the mouth, beneath the ancient oak, with the April sun warming her shoulders and the scent of new grass rising from the earth, and she felt him go perfectly still, the way he always went still when something mattered too much for movement, and then his hand came up to cradle her jaw, and he kissed her back with 3 years of waiting in every touch. When they broke apart, his forehead resting against hers, his breath uneven, she said, "I love you." He closed his eyes. "Say it again." "I love you." Again. "I love you, Piers." And the Duke of Colverton, who had never wept in front of another human being in his adult life, pressed his face into the curve of her neck and let out a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a breath, but something in between. The sound of a man who had held everything together for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to let go. She held him, The oak stood guard above them, its branches beginning to bud with the year's new leaves. The wildflowers grew between the flagstones, unnamed and resilient and beautiful. The London season of 1849 began in April, and the Duke and Duchess of Colverton arrived at their Mayfair townhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, in a carriage drawn by 4 matched greys, with half the street watching from behind their curtains. Now, it is worth understanding what the London season represented for a newly married duchess, particularly one whose marriage had been preceded by a scandal of such extraordinary proportions. The season was not merely a social calendar. It was a court of public opinion, a theatre of reputation where every entrance, every gown, every word spoken was observed, catalogued, and judged. For Lisette, who had spent 3 seasons standing at the edges of ballrooms, invisible and unmourned, the prospect of entering London society as the Duchess of Colverton was both her greatest vindication and her greatest terror. Piers knew this. He had spent weeks preparing her for this moment without appearing to prepare her at all. He had mentioned, casually, which hostesses were sympathetic and which were venomous. He had told her stories about the Tons hierarchies, who deferred to whom, which alliances were genuine and which were theatrical, how to read a room by watching where people stood rather than listening to what they said. He had taught her the geography of power, and he had done it over breakfast and during evening walks and while playing chess in the library, so naturally that she absorbed it, the way soil absorbs rain. He had arranged everything with his customary thoroughness. The townhouse, 6 stories of Portland stone on Grosvenor Square, had been opened and staffed weeks in advance. A new wardrobe had been commissioned from the finest modiste in London, each gown selected not for fashion, but for power. When Lisette came down the stairs on the evening of their first ball, the Countess of Ashton's spring assembly, the most anticipated event of the early season, she wore midnight blue silk that made her copper hair blaze like a flame, and the Colverton sapphires at her throat, and a look on her face that look was not quite confidence, but something better. Resolution. The ballroom went silent when they entered, not the gradual fade of conversation that happens when someone important arrives. A complete, sudden, breathless silence, the kind that follows a thunderclap. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway where the Duke of Colverton stood with his wife on his arm, and the whispering began before they had taken 3 steps. She is the one, the real one, the twin who was drugged. He knew at the altar, he knew from the kiss. Lisette felt every gaze like a needle against her skin. Her fingers tightened on Piers's arm. He covered her hand with his, warm, steady, certain, and leaned down until his lips were beside her ear. "They are looking at you," he murmured, "because you are the most extraordinary woman in this room. You were that woman when no one noticed. Now they have no choice." The Countess of Ashton approached first, a formidable woman of 60, whose approval was worth more than gold in London's social economy. She took both of Lisette's hands in hers, looked her in the eyes with the piercing assessment of a woman who had witnessed every scandal since the Regency, and said, loud enough for the nearest 30 people to hear, "Your Grace, we have been waiting for you." It was a benediction, an endorsement, a declaration that the Duchess of Colverton was not merely accepted, but welcomed, and that anyone who thought otherwise could take it up with the Countess. The evening unfolded like a dream Lisette had never dared to have. Women who had ignored her for 3 seasons now curtsied and smiled and competed for her attention. Men who had never asked her to dance now begged for the honour. Matrons whispered approvingly about her composure, her grace, the quiet dignity with which she navigated a room that knew her most private humiliation. And Piers, who had endured 3 years of watching other men fail to notice the woman he adored, stood at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of brandy he did not drink and watched his wife shine, and felt something settle inside his chest that had been restless for as long as he could remember. At 10:30, Lord Pemberton, a red-faced baron with more port than sense, approached Lisette at the refreshment table and said, in a voice designed to carry, "I must say, Your Grace, you are remarkably brave. After what your family did, many women would have retreated from society entirely." The room held its breath. Lisette set down her glass. She looked at Lord Pemberton with the same quiet, clear-eyed directness that Piers had loved since the first moment he saw her. And she said, "My family's actions are their own to carry, Lord Pemberton. I have carried enough for other people. I intend to put that weight down." The silence that followed was followed by something unprecedented. Lady Gwendolen, standing nearby, began to clap, slowly, deliberately, and the Countess of Ashton joined her, and then a woman Lisette did not know, and then another, until the applause spread across the ballroom like ripples in water, and Lisette stood in the centre of it, with tears she refused to let fall and a spine made of steel. Lord Pemberton retreated. He did not trouble her again. When they returned home that evening in the carriage in the dark, Piers took her hand and kissed her knuckles, each one slowly with a reverence that made her breath catch. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was terrified." "Those are not mutually exclusive." She turned to him in the dark of the carriage. "I keep thinking I will wake up, that I will be back in that room with the curtains drawn and the door locked, and all of this, you, the house, the diamonds, the applause, will have been the laudanum dream. Then I will tell you what is real." He drew her close, his arm around her shoulders, his lips against her temple. "The scar below your left ear, your left, is real. The way you tilt your head when you listen is real. The fact that I have loved you since a spring ball in 1845 is real. And you, sitting here in this carriage, wearing sapphires and a look that could bring Parliament to its knees, you are the most real thing in my world." She leaned into him. The carriage rocked gently over the cobblestones. London passed by outside the window in a blur of gaslight and shadow. "Piers?" "Yes?" "How many days now?" He was quiet for a moment. 3 years, 11 months, and 7 days. "You will run out of days eventually." "No, I will simply start counting forward instead of back. This story reminds me of something I have been thinking about lately. The idea that the people who see us most clearly are not always the people closest to us. Sometimes the person who understands you best is the one standing at the edge of the room, watching, waiting, cataloguing all the things about you that your own family never bothered to notice." The years that followed were kind. Lisette transformed Colverton House from a bachelor's fortress into a home, not by redecorating or rearranging or imposing her taste upon its rooms, but by filling it with life. She catalogued every wildflower on the estate, continuing the work Piers's mother had begun, and published the results in a botanical journal under her own name. Not a male pseudonym, but Lisette Stratton, Duchess of Colverton. When the journal's editors hesitated, Piers made a single visit to their offices, and the hesitation ceased. She opened the Colverton grounds to the village school children every spring, guiding them through the gardens, teaching them the Latin names of flowers, showing them that knowledge was not a privilege reserved for those born into wealth. She hosted dinners where scientists sat beside politicians and artists sat beside soldiers, and the conversations that resulted were so remarkable that people began requesting invitations months in advance. She bore 3 children in 4 years, 2 girls and a boy, and watched with quiet wonder as Piers, the most feared duke in England, lay on a nursery floor with a copper-haired infant sleeping on his chest, and an expression on his face so tender it was almost unrecognizable. He kept something, all those years, in his study, in the top drawer of his desk, the same desk where he had planned the destruction of the Thurlo family and the salvation of the woman he loved. He kept a pressed flower, a wildflower, a common English bluebell taken from the south garden on the day Lisette had first shown him the 37 species she could identify by sight. He had picked it when she was not looking and pressed it between the pages of his journal, and it remained there, faded and fragile and perfect, long after the journal was full and the years had turned the pages soft. She found it years later while looking for a pen. She held the bluebell in her palm, small, dried, impossibly delicate, and she remembered the garden and the conversation and the way he had said, "I knew I was right," and she pressed the flower to her lips and closed her eyes. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. That was how long he had waited. But the love, the real love, the love that grew not from obsession but from choice, from knowing and being known, from the daily accumulation of small kindnesses and shared silences and arguments about whether Tennyson or Keats was the superior poet. That love had no count. It simply was. It had always been. And it would continue to be, long after the days stopped mattering and the numbers faded into something larger and warmer and more enduring than either of them could have imagined. And that, my friends, is the story of the twin sisters who were swapped at the altar, and the Duke who knew, from the very first kiss, that the woman he had married was not the woman he loved. It is a story about patience, about obsession, about the difference between a face and a soul, and about a man who understood that difference so completely that no deception, however perfect, could survive his attention. So tell me, what would you have done in her place? Would you have forgiven your sister? Would you have trusted a man who admitted to watching you for 3 years? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.